And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing this strong low that brought the strong winds to the Pribilof Islands and the southwest coast this afternoon, pulling north-northwestward up there toward the Russian coast in the front, also lifting northward, spreading snow across the Yukon Delta into the southern Seward Peninsula, east-southeast there into the west-central interior, right on down into Cook Inlet with a low-pressure area developing over the Kenai Peninsula once again, and that'll bring more rain and snow into southern Alaska here, especially the North Gulf Coast. Again, heaviest precipitation amounts, Prince William Sound eastward to about Cordova, but lighter for Yakutat. And this trough keeps it unsettled over the Panhandle, dry to the north with light winds and breezy with a lot of rain and snow showers over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. For tomorrow, that pattern continues out here for the Bering Sea. A lot of snow showers, but winds starting to diminish now. This low parked just off the Russian coast there. South to north flow brings snow showers into the southwest interior, and this front stalling out on the Western Brooks Range, but this low slowly moving northward into western Copper River Basin or over the Talkeetnas, give or take there. And precipitation will slowly be ending from southwest to northeast again. May take till evening though, but it'll be another wet day for the North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, and more rain pushes in mainly to the northern Panhandle. And then on Tuesday, high pressure builds in here over the Yukon, dries the eastern interior out, north slope, same thing, and kind of holding this front back a little bit here to the west over the Kuskokwim Valley, weak low over the central Aleutians, and still low pressure over the northwest Bering Sea, but winds not much of a factor out there. Light winds for the Panhandle. And for the coastal water forecast down there, south winds 20 knots for Prince of Wales Island, seas 8 feet. Central coast, south winds 20 knots, 15 to 20 knots south winds for the north coast. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. South 15 for Stevens Passage, southeast winds 20 knots with 5-foot seas for Clarence Strait. And then for Tuesday, light northwest winds here for the south coast, seas at about 7 feet. Westerlies 15 knots for the central coast, and the north coast, east winds 10 to 15 knots with 9-foot seas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, all looking at south winds, only at 10 knots, seas down to 2 feet. Light variable winds with slight seas for Clarence Strait. And for the Prince William Sound zone there, southeast winds 25 knots tomorrow, good for small craft advisory, seas at about 6 feet. West-southwest or south-southwest here for the eastern North Gulf Coast, 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, winds west 35 knots. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay and southern Cook Inlet, west winds 35 knots. Southwest 25 knots here north of the Forelands. And then for the day on Tuesday, good gales coming into Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay out of the southeast at 40 knots, seas 10 to 12 feet. Now southerly gales for Cook Inlet at 35 knots, 10-foot seas, southeast 20 knots for northern Cook Inlet. And the North Gulf Coast, small craft advisory, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, 7 to 9-foot seas. And Prince William Sound, southeast winds 25 knots, seas 6 feet. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 25 knots for the day Monday. Same thing for Bristol Bay with 8-foot seas there. Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Tuesday, gale warnings Kodiak Island, south winds 35 knots. West-southwest 25 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula with 8 to 12-foot seas. Bristol Bay, south winds 30 knots, seas 12 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, small craft advisory, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots with 12 to 15-foot seas. West to 25 for Adak and Atka, and 30-knot winds out of the west from Adak all the way out to Shemya. And then for the day on Tuesday, from Kiska westward there, we're looking at southwest winds 30 to 40 knots. Otherwise, from Kiska eastward to Adak, west winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, west winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the southwest coast, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, there are gale warnings out for Monday for south winds at 35 knots. And a little lighter, but still a pretty brisk south wind at 30 knots for Norton Sound. Southwest 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island. West 30 for the Pribilofs, and southwest winds 30 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast with 10-foot seas. And for Tuesday, south winds 20 knots here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast at 20 for the Yukon Delta coast. Pribilofs west at 20, but west at 30 there for St. Matthew Island. And small craft advisories for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound for southeast winds at 25 knots. Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast, Monday, east-northeast at 10. And for the central and western Arctic coast, east winds 15 knots. The Chukchi Sea looking at southeast winds 20 to 25 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. And then for Tuesday, big increase in the winds here for the Chukchi Sea. Gale warnings, south to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Western Arctic coast south at 25 knots. Southwest winds 20 knots for the central coast, and the eastern Boulevard Sea coast more of a westerly direction at 20 knots.